Okay, so this lecture is about what I would call boundary and region description. And also, I guess I would say, filtering. So what do I mean by that? So far, we've really talked about finding shapes, for example, with graph cut or active contours, or just plain thresholding, that really are focused on finding a single shape that we call the foreground, and we're trying to separate from the background, right? But in the real world, we probably have situations where we've got lots of shapes. So say you're trying to find, cells on a petri dish. And so we may get lots and lots of returns that pass the threshold. So for example, we may get, real cells that have all sorts of different shapes. We may get some extra noise and stuff that we want to perhaps filter out. And so certainly, like we talked about last time, you can use things like erosion and opening and closing and so on to kind of process some of this stuff, maybe get rid of some of the small crap. But in general, maybe we're forced to, or not forced, we're faced with the problem of maybe we've got a 50 or 100 different sized and shaped objects, and we want to find specifically ones that we care about, okay? And so that's what we're going to talk about today, is kind of situations where you have multiple objects and you want to describe them, compare them, and maybe pick some of them that have certain characteristics. And so most of the lecture is going to be about, again, the shapes of objects, but then towards the end we're going to talk about also the texture of objects, what's inside these shapes, okay? And so in Matlab, just to kind of preview what we're going to talk about, there's a great command called regionprops that does lots of stuff that you might be interested in doing. So first of all, let's talk about kind of like general properties of a shape, right? So for example, maybe this is some binary blob that comes back out of thresholding. What kinds of properties can we talk about with this blob? So there's stuff that you learned about in, elementary school, right? There's the perimeter of the blob. There's the area of the blob. There's what I would call the diameter of the blob. So the diameter would be basically what is the longest path between 2 points that are on the boundary. And then there's what I would call the bounding box of the blob. So the bounding box is basically going to be like an axis-aligned rectangle that tightly encloses the thing that we found, something like this. Okay, so that all is probably familiar to you. One thing that we could derive from this then, for example, is the what's called the compactness of the blob. And that's defined as the perimeter squared over the area. And so let's think about what the range of this value could be. So the best you could do would be a circle, right? So we know from kind of the way that shapes form in nature that if you've got a certain amount of area, the most kind of parsimonious or compact way of representing that is to draw a circle that encloses that area. So the perimeter of the circle is going to be 2 pi r. We square that. The area is going to be pi r squared. And when we do this division, we get 4 pi, right? So that's basically about as low as the compactness can be. But then you can imagine that I could take the same area and I could distribute it over some really crazy squirrely region that had lots of thin protrusions and, basically I could make a shape that has the same area as a circle with kind of an arbitrarily high perimeter, right? So for here, the compactness would kind of tend to infinity, right? So we kind of have a low of 4 pi, a high of infinity. And then we could, if we wanted to define, to make it a little bit easier, what's called the circularity. The circularity is basically the inverse, more or less, of the compactness. And we have this 4 pi factor like so. And so for this, the maximum, obviously, that you could have for a circle would be 1. And again, for a really squirrely object, it would be small, and the worst case would be basically 0, right? So basically something where you've got a long perimeter, and this really squirrely object that has the same area, would go to 0, okay? So immediately we could kind of filter on how circular an object is. Okay, we're going to come to that, back to that in just a minute. Another important property of an object is its centroid. Okay, so again, let's go back to some kind of arbitrary blob. So the centroid is kind of like the center of mass of the object. So it's not the middle of the bounding box. It's kind of, you know, related to where are most of the pixels located, right? So we could call this centroid, you know, maybe we give it an x value and a y value, right? This is fundamentally just taking the average value of all the points in the object, and this here is the number of points in the object, right? So I could take my binary blob, and I could compute the weighted average of these points, and I would get this center of mass, or centroid, okay? Now, more specifically, you know, this may be a complicated shape, and it's very common in terms of shape processing to want to just kind of simplify this shape to what is the kind of best fit ellipse that goes around this object, and then talk about the properties of that ellipse. So for example, here's kind of a arbitrary object, and then maybe if I fit an ellipse to it, it would look something like this. Probably not really like this, but something like this. So this is the centroid of the object, and then this is like kind of the best fit ellipse. And then, as we'll talk about in a second, we can talk about the, you know, the distance here of this major axis. We can talk about the orientation of this ellipse and so on. You'll notice that when I fit the ellipse, there's going to be some parts of the shape that are inside the ellipse and some parts of the shape that are outside the ellipse. That's okay. But basically, the ellipse is just kind of like a very simple approximation of the shape that we actually have. Okay. So let's talk about, you know, how would I get that ellipse? Well, I would compute a, you know, so how to get this ellipse. Well, I could compute a covariance matrix that would be, here's like kind of the unbiased estimate of the covariance matrix, where I sum up over all of the points in the shape this big set of 2 by 2 matrices, right? So this is basically, you know, this is a 2 by 1 vector, this is a 1 by 2 vector. So this whole thing is going to be a 2 by 2 matrix, right? Very similar to how you compute the sample covariance of a bunch of samples for a distribution. And then I can let the eigenvalues and eigenvectors of this matrix, I have a pair of them, right? So these are the eigenvalues and the eigenvectors. And let's let lambda 1 be the bigger one. Because of the way that we set this covariance matrix up, the eigenvalues are always going to be greater than or equal to 0, and for a blob that has any sort of actual size, they're going to both be positive numbers. So what do these vectors and eigenvalues tell us? Well, they tell us the size of this ellipse and its orientation. And so to be a little bit more concrete, if I have this ellipse and I center it at the centroid, again, this is my normal kind of Cartesian coordinates. So this vector here, I mean the unit vector that we get is going to be the first eigenvalue, or first eigenvector. Perpendicular to that is the second eigenvector, and the length here is related to the eigenvalue. It turns out to be 2 times the square root of lambda 1, and this turns out to be 2 times the square root of lambda 2. So if you're using, for example, like the Gonzalez textbook, you know, some places can be a little bit slangy about this. If you actually compute the actual values you get from the covariance computation, it's kind of related to the square roots of the eigenvalues, not the eigenvalues themselves. And then, of course, I could also talk about the orientation of this ellipse, which is kind of like how far off is V1 from the x-axis. So to summarize, basically, V1 gives me the direction of the major axis. V2 gives me the direction of the minor axis. 2 square root of lambda 1, actually 2 times this gives me the length of the major axis. And this gives me the length of the minor axis. Okay. So let's just actually do this with an example in Matlab to kind of verify that everything makes sense. So here, let's make a ellipse. Okay, so I'm going to make a, whoops, I guess I'm not actually in the window, sorry. So let's make a mesh of points centered at 100, or centered at 0. And then I'm going to make a function that is kind of like the equation of a circle, except it's going to be each of the terms gets weighted by a different factor. That's what gives me the elliptical shape. And then I'm just going to make an image where I'm going to threshold this guy to some value. And now if I look at this image, whoops, I should see that, in fact, it looks like, oh, what did I do wrong here? What did I do wrong here? I'm baffled by why I got 4 ellipses instead of just 1 ellipse centered in the middle. Oh, you know why? Because I did this mesh grid wrong. Sorry. As I was saying to my class, you're inevitably going to screw something up in Matlab, and you shouldn't be embarrassed about it. Okay, so how about this? Let's see where my picture went. Okay, here we go. This is what I wanted, right? Is just a normal ellipse, and I can use this little Matlab tool picker to kind of see manually how wide things are. So here, the left edge is at 50,101. The right edge is at 150,101. So basically, it's about 100 pixels wide, and then this value is 171. This value is 100, 130. So it's about 60 pixels high. Okay, and we should be able to verify that without having to actually manually click on things. And so let's just use this regionprops command that I told you about to find some properties of this binary blob. So you can see that here what I found out is that this is a object that has a certain area. It's centered in the middle like we knew it was. I get the bounding box, which is kind of like the lower left-hand point of the box that encloses the ellipse. And then I've got the length and width of that box, which I just measured by hand was 100 by 59, or yeah, 99 by 59. So that's good. And if I were to look at the documentation for regionprops, which I'm going to do in just a second, I can see that I can actually get a lot more than just these numbers out of regionprops. And it will also work when I have lots and lots of different blobs. Okay. So let's go back for a second to talk more about what I could derive from this ellipse. You know, we talked about the circularity earlier, but I could also talk about what's called the eccentricity of the ellipse. And that's defined as, again, if I draw my ellipse. So Matlab will give you numbers that are slightly different, which are probably more useful in the real world, right? It gives you this length is M1, and this length is M2. So basically you get the whole length of the ellipse and the whole height of the ellipse. And then the eccentricity is defined as this basically ratio between the minor axis length and the major axis length with a little bit of quadratic stuff. So again, let's think about a circle. A circle would have major axis and minor axis that are exactly the same. So M1 equals M2. This becomes 1. The whole thing becomes 0. So this thing has eccentricity 0. And then the worst case scenario, right, is something that is super, super skinny that has a huge major axis and a very small minor axis, in which case this number is almost 0 and the eccentricity is 1. So kind of best case is a circle, worst case is like a super, super long skinny line. Okay. And so now if I wanted to, you could imagine that I could filter on, for example, how big the blob is and how circular the blob is. And so let's do an example of that. So here I have an image that is totem pole. Let me just turn the warning off because I know it's going to complain. And I don't know where my image went. Here we go. So here you can see that what I'm going to try and do in this example is to find, say I want to find the eyes of this totem pole. Okay, so they're black. There's lots of other black stuff in the image too, right? And so just for the sake of argument, let me say, okay, well, first what I'm going to do is, for example, threshold this to find the dark regions. So I'm going to make a binary image that is all the places where the grayscale value of this image is less than some threshold, say 100. When I look at that, what I get is this binary image, and I can see that I'm going to get these eyes that I want, but I also get tons of other stuff, right? So there's lots of other dark stuff in the image. And actually, what's interesting is the whole background of the image is white also, and so actually we can see why that's true. If I were to look back at the original image, I can see that the background is actually fairly dark, right? And so when I threshold, I basically put all this stuff under the threshold, and I can see also that the way that the blobs have kind of merged is that actually the background is seeping into this big eyebrow of this totem, and so there's really one huge, you know, pixels equal to one binary region that we have to deal with at some point, right? Okay, so let's look at region props, right? So first of all, let's look at the documentation for region props, which popped up in some other place. Here we go. So let's see what we got here. So region props, by default, just gives me the area, the bounding box, and the centroid, right? But if I scroll down, I can see that region props knows how to do a lot of other stuff, and that's what I'm going to look at next. So here, for example, let's see what these properties are. So I got the ones we already know about: area, bounding box, centroid. Then there's a few other things, right? Convex hull is basically a polygon that fits around the shape. We'll talk about that in a minute. Eccentricity we just talked about. Euler number I'm going to come back to. And then let's see, it will fill in the holes for you. Here we go. So here's major axis length and minor axis length. These are the, you know, the values that we just talked about for the ellipse, along with the orientation. And then there's the perimeter, and then there's something called solidity, which I'm going to talk to you in a minute. Solidity basically says, once I draw the bounding box around the object, how many of those pixels are actually part of the binary object, right? So it can help me find things that are really filled in or really not filled in, right? So now if I do region props on this binary image, it says I got actually 204 binary blobs in this picture, which I guess I can believe because, you know, there's lots of very small blobs, and turns out there are 204 of them. Now, what we talked about last time was morphological operations, and so you could imagine that you could use things like erosion and opening and closing to get rid of some of these really small blobs, but today I'm just going to do things purely based on things like area and shape, okay? So I was talking about, you know, if I want to figure out whether these blobs are circular or not, I need more than just these things. And so you can also call region props and say, okay, I want certain things. I want the area, and maybe I want the eccentricity, which we talked about earlier. And now if I just ask for that, I get a structure that has just the things that I want. And so what I could do is, oh, one thing I want to say about region props, though, is that the syntax is a little bit weird. So if you say, give me the area, what you'll find is basically a collection of 204 answers, right? What you want to do instead, if you want to assign this to a variable, is put it in brackets like this. So now I can see that this A is a 204 length vector. So I'm going to collect the areas into that. I'm going to collect the eccentricities into another vector. Did I spell that right? Looks okay. And now I can say, okay, find me the places where, for example, the area vector is greater than 50 pixels, and if I want to find round objects, I want the eccentricity to be low, right? So maybe my eccentricity should be less than, say, 0.4. And then let's find out which of those blobs pass the test. Turns out only 3 blobs pass the test. And I wrote a little bit of a helper function, which was not hard to do, that I called highlight. Highlight is just something that I made that will take the binary image, which blobs I want to highlight, and the original image, and it will draw the blobs that I ended up passing the test in red. Okay, that makes it a little bit easier to see. Before actually I do that, the other thing I wanted to mention is there's a kind of a nice function called BWlabel. That's another good thing to know. So BWlabel, if I pass it a binary image, then if I look at this label image, basically this is an image where every color corresponds to a different blob. And some of them are kind of hard to see because they're close to dark blue, right? So I can see that every single blob gets a slightly different color. A little bit hard to see because of the fact that some colors look very similar, but here, for example, I can see that these 2 eyes are clearly different blobs, right? So this is a useful thing to do. I could say something like, okay, I want to only look at the 23rd blob, and it tells me, okay, it turns out to be this one little pixel here. This is not a very interesting blob. I guess we can say, what was the blob that I found? Blob number 46. Well, blob number 46, sorry, is actually this ring around the eye. So I can see I got one of the things I was looking for. Anyway, so I kind of, based on this regionprops and also the BWlabel command, I made a function that will kind of make it a little bit easier to see which blobs pass the test. So on the left, you see the original binary image, and instead of white, the things that pass the test are in red. And then on the right are those same red regions superimposed on the original image. So what happened here, this looks a little bit weird, right? Because why have I got all this background crap? Well, if you kind of follow around, you can see that this entire background is all one connected blob. And so it seeps into the eyes, it seeps into the shoulders, and actually this blob has an eccentricity. If I think about drawing an ellipse around these pixels, actually that is a fairly, it's a fairly circular thing, right? So it passes my eccentricity test, but clearly this blob is much bigger than I want it to be, right? So then I go back to my kind of index. I say, okay, well, I don't want a crazy high area, so I'm going to want things that are bigger than 50, but not super big. Now let's see what we got. So now I only get the 2 blobs that I want in the first place, which turn out to be these 2 very circular responses, right around that eye. And then I could say, well, okay, so maybe I want to increase my threshold so that I get more objects that are not quite as circular. So here I'm going to make my eccentricity threshold 0.7 instead of 0.4, and let's see what we got now. So now I've got both of these eyes, and I've got some other stuff now that is, if I think about drawing the ellipse around these things, this guy here, for example, this U shape, if I were to draw an ellipse around it, that's kind of a circle, right? So what if I want to filter out on that? Well, I could use another one of those regionprops properties, which we were looking at, called solidity, right? So solidity basically says, if I were to draw the bounding box around the object, what percentage of the pixels are going to be filled in 1? And so then things like these U-shapes are going to fail that test. So for that, I need to go back to my regionprops and also ask for a new parameter. And let's call that S, collected into a vector. Now if I make my index and say, okay, now I want things where the fraction of solidity is high, say 70% of the pixels in that rectangle have to be filled in. And let's see what we got. So now actually I got the circles of the eyes, and I filtered out all these U shapes, but now actually I've lost the rings around the eyes, because if you think about it, these rings are hollow, right? So they don't pass the solidity test. So, I mean, there's no magic bullet, but this is the kind of thing where you could kind of go back and forth trying to use the properties of the regions to filter out exactly what you wanted. And you can see that this would be super useful for something where you're doing like cell segmentation on a petri dish, where you've got lots and lots of blobs, some of them you care about, some of them you don't, and this would be a way to filter out the ones that you care about. Okay, so let's go back to the notes now. So one thing that you saw if you scroll past the region props possibilities is called the Euler number, and that's kind of related to the topology of the blob, which basically is a fancy word of talking about, you know, the Euler number is a way to describe a blob that has to do with how many connected components the blob has, minus how many interior holes the blob has. Okay? So for example, if I was doing a character recognition thing, you know, this number 1, it's one connected component and it has 0 holes, so the Euler number here is 1. If I have a 6, right, I have one connected component and one big hole, and so my Euler number is 0. And if I had an 8, then I have one connected component, 2 holes, so the Euler number is -1, right? So you could imagine that what I could do, for example, in the case with the totem pole, I'm not going to go back to it, but basically I could say, okay, you know, I could look for solid blobs with no holes, apply some sort of threshold to those. Then I could look for blobs that have a hole inside of them, and I could apply some sort of different threshold to maybe go back and try and pick out the ring. So for example, maybe for blobs that have Euler number 0, I apply a stricter circularity threshold to go back and get just those supercircular blobs for the rings around the eyes, right? And it's not quite the same, but I thought it was a little bit related. So you may have seen these numbers on the bottoms of your checks, at least if you live in the US. I don't know if it's a global standard. But basically, these are usually printed in magnetic ink. And you can imagine now, based on what we've learned about how you could filter on shape, that the way that these things have different centroids, they have different topology, right? So you've got a 6 that has a hole down here, you've got a 9 that has a hole up here, you've got an 8 that has 2 holes, you've got 0 that has a big hole. You've got these kind of fat-bottomed 1, so that the center of mass of this object is way down here, and the center of mass of the 4 is going to be somewhere else, right? So these have been very carefully designed so that as a magnetic scanner went across the number on the bottom of the check, that based on the pattern of black magnetic ink on the check, you could very easily distinguish these numbers, right? So back in the day, it wasn't an optical problem, it was a magnetic kind of signal processing problem. But, you know, this is kind of a clever way of thinking about how could we design some shapes that will have very identifiable features in terms of center of mass, number of holes, stuff like that. So you can read more about that. This is called the Magnetic Ink Character Recognition font, MICR. Okay, so if you wanted to go even further than this, you could, for example, you know, the ellipse is what's called a second order moment, and that's, you know, kind of like a very low coarse approximation to a shape. If I wanted to get fancier, I could use higher order moments, or we could bring back all of our tools from, you know, Fourier theory. So for example, let's suppose that I have some sort of a shape like this. You know, this shape can be described as a closed contour where I have a function of t. As I go around, I could parameterize from t equals, say, 0 to 1. As I go around the shape, what I could do is I could make a complex valued function, which is the x-coordinate plus j times the y-coordinate. Now this is going to be a periodic complex function, and I could talk about the Fourier transform of this function, right? And then I could, or maybe in this case it would be more appropriate to talk about the Fourier series of this function, right? Because it's a continuous time function. So let me just say, actually, if it was a Fourier series, I would basically have the kind of a through k, you know, coefficients. This would be like the Fourier series coefficients. And then you could do something along the lines of, you know, you could kind of low-pass filter this shape and get something that ironed out, you know, suppose that the shape was like kind of wiggly here. you could get something that would iron out all the high frequency stuff, and maybe I could make a approximation that wasn't an ellipse, but was kind of like a, like a smooth blob, right? And maybe I would get this by adding the first, 3 or 4 Fourier series terms, right? And if I added more terms, I'd recover the squiggliness of the boundary, right? So, I mean, I'm not going to talk about this too much, but you could certainly go in that direction if you wanted to analyze the shape more. And so certainly some of my own research, when we've looked at interesting shapes that come from segmenting objects in CAT scans, for example, it turned out that this Fourier descriptor idea was a nice way to talk about the shapes of blobs, retaining their kind of innate character while smoothing away all the junk you didn't care about. So, and those of you that know about what's called PCA, principal component analysis, this is another way of talking about describing a shape. The difference here is that this is a situation where you maybe have a whole bunch of training shapes. Again, could come from some sort of biomedical application where these are pictures of someone, pictures of different patients' livers, for example. So you have a whole bunch of training shapes. And then you use these to basically build a model for how likely is it to observe a shape that has a certain look based on all the examples you saw before. Actually, I have a whole separate lecture on PCA for shape fitting. It's towards the end of this lecture series. So you can flip forward to the very last lecture to find out more about shape analysis and shape fitting using PCA. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about that too much here. Okay, last concept that I want to talk about is related to, many of the shapes that I draw freehand, right? Everything I've drawn so far is kind of like blobby, right? But you can imagine that if I had something that was more like a branching structure. So here's like a gingerbread man, or something that was, here's like a kind of a, let me just pull up a web browser for a second. So let's look for, retinal blood vessels. That's it. Searching. Right, so here's a good example. So here's a case where I've got a original image, I've done some sort of thresholding processing, now I get a binary shape that's really weird and branchy, right? So stuff like fitting an ellipse to this binary blob is not going to help me at all with shape analysis, right? So to draw that freehand, maybe I've got, some sort of a weird branching structure. And I want to characterize, kind of what's going on here. It's more like a tree and less like a blob, right? And maybe I have a blob over here at the end, right? So there are some specifically good ways to talk about shapes like this, and typically you would look for what I would say is called the skeleton or the medial axis. So what I mean there is that, kind of what I like to be able to do is to abstract this shape into something like, a stick figure human, right? Something where I just get the kind of key concept of the shape, the interior skeleton of this thing. In this case, I would like to be able to get something that was kind of like a 1 pixel wide trace that just goes right down the center of all of these, say, blood vessels, right? I guess I drew these a little bit thin. So then you could imagine that if I had this kind of 1 pixel wide skeleton, I could do things like find the topology, say there are some branch points, how far apart is this distance, how many branches come off of each node, what is the distance between the source and the last branch, right? So you can imagine that you could analyze a shape that way, you could compare shapes, and you could match shapes. The details of how do you estimate this skeleton, there are a couple ways, right? One way is, I'll just say this in a very high-level way. One way has to do with, like we talked about last time, you could imagine that you could get there by a series of successive erosion type steps, right? I keep on peeling away the boundary of this contour until I got just down to the center line, right? Another way is what's called the distance transform, which basically says, compute the distance of every interior point to the boundary. And then you can imagine that the skeleton is actually the place where I have a local maxima of that distance, right? It's the furthest point. So it's kind of like the ridges of this thing. So you can imagine that, for example, the distance is low here and it's highest in the middle and that drops back down again. So if I found a local maxima of that distance, I'd get a pretty good shot at finding the skeleton. In general, in terms of a more formal definition of what constitutes this medial axis, you could basically define it as, points that have more than one nearest neighbor. Right? So what does that mean? So again, if I think about it, a point over here, has just one nearest neighbor, right? It's not on the medial axis. A point over here, right? This point has two places on the boundary that it is exactly equidistant from, right? Same thing like over here, right? This point has two neighbors, right? And so I look for those kinds of points. Another way to think about this is that if I were to draw a circle that is centered at the point, which points have circles that are basically sandwiched right inside the shape, right? And so something like this, right, has a much larger, of course I didn't draw this very well, like this point here would have like a much larger radius circle. So you can extract the skeleton. I'll talk about this in Matlab in just a second with a command called BWmorph. Before I go on, though, let me just say that, even though this is like what you'd like to get, in practice, things can be sometimes a little bit harder than that. So for example, let's think about this very simple rectangle, right? What's the medial axis of this? You'd kind of hope that it would be something like this, right? That this kind of gets abstracted into just a line. But if you think about it, actually, the medial axis of this rectangle includes, like all these points and all these points too. Why is that? Well, think about, again, a point over here is, I could fit a little circle around here that's equidistant to the boundary, right? And I could fit a circle around here that's bigger, that's tangent to the boundary at two places, right? So, these little x-wings are not really necessarily that desirable. I think these are called spurs sometimes. Not usually what you want. And then, so usually, let me just say that, some sort of what's called pruning is required to remove them. So let's look at a couple examples, and I'll come back to this in just a second. So first of all, let's close this guy up. So let's go back to Matlab. And here I have some very simple like letter shapes. So, and I'm going to make this a little bit easier for me because I know these are grayscale images. So I'm going to, don't worry about this part too much. What happened here? Maybe it's already a RGB. Maybe it's already a grayscale image. Right, so here's an example of a simple binary image. Then I can call this BW, let's look at the documentation, BWmorph. So if I scroll down, I can see that, this command includes stuff like hole filling and outlining, but the one I want is skell, okay, which is the skeleton. So if I say, show me the skeleton of this A shape, what I get is, something you can tell is an A, and these are the spurs that I was talking about. These kind of chicken feet come from the extra points on the medial axis. And so even though these images are fairly clean, I have a whole bunch of images of different letters. So let me just sneak this in here to make it just one command. So, for example, I can see here, I've got B and F and G and H and so on, right? So if I look at the skeletons of these things with different values or different letters, so then I can find, let's just make this a little bit easier to see here. And move my Matlab window over, sorry. Okay, then I can see, for example, that, I can clearly tell that these are different letters. And you can imagine that if you were like trying to compare different letters from different fonts, for example, that you would be able to take Times New Roman and sans serif font and be able to kind of extract the fundamental connectivity of the shape in terms of, how things are put together inside, rather than all the flowery stuff that may make it harder to tell what the shape is. I guess I have a P, like an X, right? But here you see that we have these weird spurs, right? And so how would you get rid of these spurs? Well, you can imagine, again, I'm not going to talk about it too much, but again, every one of these points you could think about as how many points are connected to it, right? So like a point at the very end of this spur is only connected to one other point on the skeleton. A point over here is connected to two other points, and a point over here, like this, is connected to three other points. And so, for example, what I could do is I could incrementally start at the endpoints that only are connected to one other point, and I could start to remove those points until I arrive at a place where it was previously a junction, right? If I arrive at a point that was previously multi-connected, three or more points instead of two, then I could stop, right? And that would allow me to just kind of get this medial axis that I want, right? Again, that stuff is kind of tedious. I'm not going to talk about it too much, but you could imagine how you could kind of talk about morphological operations that would make that work. Okay, and so here's kind of a cumulative example. I was thinking about assigning this as a homework in my class, but it's a little bit too complicated. But just to kind of recapitulate, the stuff we talked about so far. So here is an example that I thought was kind of possibly cool. So this is a coral that I saw when I was snorkeling in January. And so, it's got a lot of very interesting, intricate shape, and there are these pathways, right? And I was thinking when I saw this, this could be a good image processing problem, like tracing these paths, right? So let's try and make a start at how we would do that. I'm not going to complete the process, but for example, I could click on this and say, okay, well, the average intensity here is probably like, 140 or 130, something like that. I mean, if I click around, I can see some points are lighter, some points are darker. So I could say, okay, what if I were to look at the pixels that were greater than 130 in intensity? What would I get? Why did we get this wrong? RGB gray. Oh, I put this parenthesis in the wrong place. So if I did that, actually I kind of get the inverse of what I want, because I want things that are brighter than this. So say this, right? So here, I get some of the coral stuff, but also I got, a lot of this background junk, and I got a bunch of stuff that was background seeping into the coral. So, I mean, I could try to use region props to get rid of some of this stuff, but to kind of bring it back to some of the other lectures, let's try going back and segmenting the coral first with some other kind of lower level algorithm, right? So for example, I could use the, image segmenter built into Matlab. And first thing I could try is using, for example, something like active contours, right, to outline that shape. So let's see what we got here. So let's load the image, coral image. So we talked about a few different possibilities, right? One thing I could try is, what if I were to try and build an active contour or a snake that would snap around this object. So if I try that, I mean, this is not going to be so great, right? I can see that, yes, the contour is kind of shrinking towards the boundary of the coral in some places, which is good, but I've already I've got a problem with it seeping into this dark thing over here because of the way I segmented it, right? So maybe this is not going to succeed. I don't even think I need to let this run. Different alternative would be to do graph cuts, right? Like we talked about. So I could just say, okay, I'm going to scribble on stuff that I know is foreground, and then I'm going to mark some points that I know are background. Oh, I got a little bit close there, but okay. Let the graph cut do its magic. And actually, I can see this is pretty good. I can kind of turn down the opacity to see, I actually got most of what I wanted on the first go. I can show the underlying superpixels. We talked about superpixels in a previous lecture. And I can see here that maybe, I can change how big these superpixels are to help my segmentation, perhaps. So here, maybe that does a little bit better. And then I can use a little bit of graph cut refinement to remove a little bit of this sea urchin activity. See how we did there. So that did a pretty good initial segmentation, right? I'm not going to make this perfect. I'm just going to, say that looks good. Then I can export these images back into my Matlab workspace. I get both the binary blob and also there's this image called masked image. So if I were to look at this masked image, this is really what I want, right? This is like the bound. I see I got some stuff that I didn't actually notice. But here, this is just the coral that I want, right? So now, if I were to threshold this instead of the original image, I would get something that was a little bit better. So I could say, let my new binary image be the places where this thing is locally bright, greater than 130. So this should be better than what I had before, right? Here, I don't have any of the other junk. Now, applying what we learned from the last lecture, I could say, okay, this looks pretty good, but there are, some holes inside the coral, and I can fill in those holes. So I could use the BWfill command, where I pass it this image, and I say fill in the holes. Again, this is underlying technology as a morphological operation. So now if I look at BW2, I get something where now the holes are basically filled in. And now I have a good shot at looking at these brain-like paths and looking at the skeleton of this, for example. So if I look at the skeleton of what I just created, I can hopefully get something that is on the road to kind of outlining just the center lines of those brain corals. And I could see, it's not perfect. There's definitely more work I'd have to do. But, if I wanted to answer the question of, how long was this thing, if I pruned away these little spurs, I would have actually pretty good centerline traces going around the coral, right? So, I mean, there's a lot more to do to actually make this work. There's all this weird stuff on this end, right? What's happening there? That's because the threshold was, too bright over here, so this is all like blown out. Again, maybe I could use an adaptive threshold to locally find the brighter stuff in the background, right? So you could imagine going to town in this example a little bit more, but that's about as far as I want to go on this right now. Okay, so good. Let me close this guy up. So last thing I want to talk about in this lecture is that, so far everything I've talked about is purely shape-based, right? Purely a binary shape. But, don't forget that under the hood, right, after I do my binary segmentation, just like with the coral example, remember that there are underlying intensities, or more generally colors, inside each binary blob. And so instead of just purely segmenting the shape of the blob, I can go back and say, okay, now that I've got this blob, what was going on inside of it, right? What we care about is the texture can also be, filtered, right? That can also be a place where I filter things. And so what do I mean by that? I care about whether this region is flat or noisy or stripy, something like that, right? Now, I could use, I could use the Fourier transform to do this, right? I could look at the high frequency coefficients, and I could look at and see how much energy is in low frequency, how much is in high frequency. I could do this with Fourier analysis, but Fourier analysis is a little bit clunky and it's a little bit hard to interpret. And it'd be nice if there was a way to do this kind of purely in the spatial domain. So what I want to talk about is kind of a set of less cumbersome methods than the Fourier transform. So one easy thing is to look at basically the histogram of the grayscale values localized inside the blob, right? So I could look at statistics on the histogram of the intensities inside the blob. For example, I could talk about the mean intensity, filter on bright objects or dark objects. I could talk about the second moment, also known as the variance, right? This basically speaks to the contrast of the blob, right? So if I have something, a histogram looks like this, where I'm very centered around the mean, then this is going to be a very low contrast blob, whereas something that is wider means that I have a greater range of intensities, and it's going to be a higher contrast blob, right? So basically, a flat blob, has variance. A purely flat blob would have variance equal to 0, and a noisy blob would have high variance, right? And then if I wanted to, I could do even more fancy stuff. So there's something called the third moment, which is known as the skew or the skewness. The third moment can basically tell you, is my histogram kind of off to the left or is it off to the right? So I could say, okay, maybe these two histograms could have the same mean, but it kind of tells me which direction of the mean is most of the mass on, right? So is it locally brighter or locally darker, right? And then I could talk about things like the entropy of the histogram, which kind of has to do with how, how random or how uniform it is, right? So kind of between a uniform distribution and a, bimodal distribution, these two things will have very different entropies, right? And so we'll talk more about entropy in the context of image compression, actually, is a good place to talk about entropy. And so that's coming up in the couple lectures from now. Okay, but the problem is that none of these algorithms, none of these reflect the spatial relationships of the intensities, right? All I do is I totally abstracted out where corresponding pixels were, right? And so, but we know that I could have images that have very similar histograms that look totally different, right? So for example, there's a big difference between this image and, this image, even though they have the same fraction of black and white, right? So we need something that kind of takes into account how the pixel locations colors are kind of correlated with each other, right? And that leads to an idea that is called the gray level co-occurrence matrix. Or GLCM is what it's called. So complicated name for a very simple idea. The idea is basically that I have a chunk of image. Okay, so suppose I have a chunk of pixel values. Here I'm just using small numbers to make my life easier. This is just like a piece of image, right? It extends this way, extends that way, right? So first thing I do is that I choose what's called an operator. So I specify an operator, which is basically a spatial relationship between two pixels. Super simple, right? For example, I could say, 1 pixel to the right. This basically says, I'm going to look at neighbors that are immediately to my right. And I'm going to look at the relationships between all of these pairs of 1 to the right pixels. Okay, so if there are n gray levels in image, then I'm going to make an n by n matrix that basically says, the probability that pixel 1 and pixel 2, according to whatever operator I chose, according to Q, have that pair of intensities, right? So how many times does a given pair occur throughout the whole matrix, or throughout the whole image, right? So in this example, if I just kind of keep this on the side here, so this is going to say, I have an 8 by 8 image, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, well, how often did I see 1, 1, right? I only saw it once, so I'm going to put a 1 in this box. How often did I see 1, 2? I see it once here, and I see it once here, so I'm going to put a 2 in this box. How often did I see 1, 3? I don't see any over here, 0. And go on, right? So I see there's 1, 1, 6. I see there's 1, 1, 7. I see there's 0, 2, 1s. So this matrix isn't symmetric. There's 0, 2, 2s, and so on, right? So when I'm done, I'm going to have basically a matrix that, basically will have say k pixels, which is corresponding to the total number of possible pixel pairs according to this Q, right? So for example, in this case, there are 18 pixels in this matrix, but I can only look at 15 of these as left to right pairs, right? Because I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This guy doesn't have a right-hand neighbor, so I can't talk about that, right? And so if I wanted to, I could take this matrix here, and either I could look at the raw pixel counts, or I could divide this by k to get basically actual probabilities if I wanted to. Okay, so for example, in theory, for an 8 by for our normal kind of 8-bit image, right? I would have a 256 by 256 matrix, but in practice, that's not what people do. Usually, we quantize the number of gray levels in the image. For example, 8 or maybe 16, right? Why would we do that, right? So one thing is that, it's kind of a pain to have a 256 by 256 image. Computationally, it's complex to kind of add up all these things. The other thing is kind of for robustness, right? So for example, I would want something like, 202, 158, and 201, 159 are fundamentally the same thing, right? And if I quantize these to different bins, I'm kind of disguising that fact. So if I kind of make my bins very coarse, I get a general sense of how correlated are different pairs of pixels, okay? All right, so how do I use this, right? So once I have this thing, I can kind of look at its shape, I can look at the statistics of it, and I can use this to tell the texture of different kinds of patches, right? So let's do an example of this. So let's go over to Matlab. And here, I'm going to load up a few grayscale images. Let me load these guys up first. And this guy. Okay. So what do these look like? One of them just looks like noise, and one of them looks like a sinusoidal grating, and one of them looks like a actual real image of a circuit board. Okay, so let's think about what the gray level co-occurrence matrices of these things are. So in Matlab, you might hope that the function was called GLCM, but it's not. It's called gray co-matrix. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to compute these things for each of these images. And so by default, it's using this kind of one neighbor to the right measure. And so here you can see, for example, that G1, this is for the noise image. Basically, this tells me how many pixels had a pixel of bin 1 to the left of a pixel of another bin 1, right? And here, one thing you can notice about the noisy image is basically all of these numbers are more or less the same because, this is just a random image, right? So there's no reason why there's any sort of probability that you get, similar values in different, in adjacent pixels, right? Whereas if I look at the sine wave one, wow, there's a whole different structure, lots of zeros, right? And I can actually kind of look at this in terms of a color map, right? So here, this is the color map for the first one, the noisy image, where basically every one of these values is the same, right? If I look at the one for the sine wave, I actually see that there's very little probability that, for example, a pixel in bin 8 is followed by a pixel in bin 1. Why is that? Well, it makes sense, actually, because this is a pixel. Let's look again at the image to kind of get a sense of why this is true. Right? So here, basically if I have a, if I have a dark pixel, it's very likely to be followed, it's super likely to be followed by another slightly darker pixel or a slightly brighter pixel, right? But it's not going to jump from black to white immediately because the variation between bands is very gentle, right? And so here I can see that I don't have the probability of going from black to white in one pixel step at all in this image, right? So I can immediately see from the GLCM how different these things look. And for the, oops, let's close this guy up. And for the circuit one, this is like a real image. Here there's, it's kind of halfway between, right? It's not as superstructured as the sine wave, but it's also not as noisy as the other one. This kind of says that, I'm more likely to be near a pixel that is, close to me in color and less likely to be super far away, right? So by itself, looking at this GLCM just for right-hand neighbors is not, necessarily super useful. You can see some differences. But where it really comes into play is considering how this looks when you consider a whole set of different offsets, okay? So what I can do is I can make a, tired of looking at this H. What I can do is I can make an offset vector that is basically a list of pixel adjacencies. So let me just kind of put this guy together. What did I do wrong here? Oh, I did this in the wrong direction. Right. So this is like saying, okay, I make a list of possible offsets. One neighbor over, two neighbors to the right, three neighbors to the right, four neighbors to the right, and so on, right? And then I look at how the GLCM varies as a function of the step that I took. So actually I can now look at the GLCM with this given list of offsets. And now if I look at my G1, I can see it's an 8x8 image, but I have 20 of them, right? One for each of those offset pairs. And so here I can kind of keep on doing this for my other two images. And then, you know, what I can do is talk about statistics of this matrix. So if I look at gray co-matrix, this is the way I generate the co-occurrence matrix. This is not so exciting to look at, I guess. But then at the very bottom, it says what's related to this. There's something called gray co-props, right? This says, okay, once I've got a collection of GLCMs, extract a property from them, right? So what could these properties be? So by default, it gives me a bunch of things that basically come from analyzing this 8x8 matrix. And so one thing that's really useful is what's called the correlation, right? That basically tells me what's the probability that, you know, how correlated, how predictable is it to go from one neighbor to the next, right? Is that relationship between neighbors specified by the operator predictable or not, right? In a noisy image, I don't expect there to be any sort of predictability. In a structured image, I expect there to be high correlation, high predictability, okay? And so if I look at, you know, my statistics of, what did I call it? It was gray co-props. So if I apply this to my noisy image versus my sine wave image, for example, and I guess I can actually see what this is, right? So if I were to plot the correlation of, oops, sorry. If I were to plot the correlation of each of these things and see what it looks like. So here I can see that, you know, there's basically zero correlation, no matter what offset I have, for the noisy image, right? I can't predict anything that's going to happen in that image. Whereas there's super high correlation between what's happening in my pixel and one neighbor over is correlated with like 0.9 something, right? That's super predictable. And then I can see that there's negative correlation at the basically, I guess the easiest way to think about this would be to make another figure and remind ourselves what that image originally looked like, right? So here I could zoom in on this and say, okay, well, I expect there to be super high correlation between adjacent troughs, right? So here, this pixel is 101, 108. Over here, it's 125, 105. So basically, 24 pixels away, I've got the same value. And I can see that happening. I guess I didn't go far enough. I could see that happening if I went up to 24. I would be able to say, look, there's, you know, like 97% correlation between me and my neighbor 24 pixels away. And there's negative correlation between me and my neighbor 12 pixels away. That's like the black region to the white region, okay? So final thing I want to do, and then we're going to be done, is let's look at a real example. So here I was really hungry when I was writing this lecture, and so I took a picture of a wheat thin and a Triscuit. These are American crackers for those of you that are from overseas. And so if I look at what these crackers look like, you know, this is a wheat thin. Oh man, now I'm even hungrier. And this is a Triscuit. So wheat thin and Triscuit. So again, based on color alone, these are basically the same kind of shade of tan and brown, and probably they have about the same intensity distribution, so it'd be hard to distinguish between them. But here, you know, I can see that there's texture to this Triscuit, right? There's repetitive kind of columns of Triscuit. And so there should be something predictable I can find here that I couldn't see over here in the wheat thin, which is more like noise. I made the joke in class that it's wheat noise instead of white noise. Get it? Okay, so let's again look at these gray level co-occurrence matrices. I guess in this case I need to make these grayscale images because they're color images. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to extract the statistics of these things, and then I'm going to plot the correlation, how predictable am I, and then I'm going to make a different legend where I have the wheat thin and the Triscuit. What do we got? So what do we see? So again, there is some relationship between adjacent values on the wheat thin, right, the blue line. Because, I mean, it's not like the wheat thin is a noisy cracker. It's got, smoothly varying texture. The further I go away in terms of the column I'm at, the less predictable anything is, right? Here, I can see that there's actually a lot more predictability in the Triscuit, and there's kind of like a little local peak here in terms of around 10 pixels, I can see that there's like a little peak in how predictable things are. And if I go back to look at the the Triscuit, I can see that that 10 pixels, hopefully, is roughly the distance between adjacent Triscuit rows or columns, right? So here I got 92, 143, here I got 104, 143, here I got 117, 143. So I mean, it's kind of like, 135, 142. On average, I'm kind of like roughly 10 pixels between the middles of these rows, right? And so I could, without looking at these images, detect that there was some sort of a predictability between the columns that was not present for the wheat thin. And kind of to turn it around, what I could do is use a vertical offset instead of a horizontal offset. That is, instead of looking at the offsets in the left-right direction, I could look at offsets in the up-down direction. Oh, actually, this is not the right way to do it. This should be the same, and then this should be switched, right? So here, if I switch the offsets, that's like saying now I'm going to look at differences between rows. Now life, I think, will be a little bit less predictable. So here I have to recompute these things. So now I get this image, right? So this is basically saying that if I look at the relationships between adjacent rows, there's much less predictability, right? So for example, here, again, there's really no difference between X and Y for the wheat thin, but if I look at the Triscuit, I can see that there's no reason why looking kind of at pixels that are like above me and below me, there is some predictability, but there's not this kind of local hump that comes from the periodicity of these wheat fibers, right? I guess if I made the offset a little bit bigger, maybe I could pick up that there are these kind of longer periodicity bars running between here, right? Okay. So I think that's a good point to end because looking at these crackers, I've now become super hungry. So I think that good place to stop. And now the rest of the lectures, I think the next one we're going to talk about is more about object and feature detection, kind of going beyond just kind of coarse object level description, going more into features of things that have particular corner points that we can use to match. We'll talk about that next time. Okay. See you later.